In this episode of Reaper for Radio, we're going to be talking about a really big topic, which is podcast, mixing, and mastering. So I got an email recently from a producer who is struggling with podcast mixing and mastering. And she and I were talking for a while, and I said, hey, we could do this as a one-on-one type tutoring situation, or since these are questions I get asked all the time, I could turn this into a video for Reaper for Radio and hopefully answer a lot of questions for a lot of people. And so that's what we settled on. And so what I'm going to be doing in this video is I'm going to be going through a list of her questions about podcast mixing and mastering and answering them for you here in a public setting. Now, one thing you'll notice is that I might sound a little bit boomier than usual or a little bit roomier than usual, just because I have discovered lav mics and I'm not great at using them yet, but it's really nice. I've got both hands free for once and there's nothing like in front of my face. But the other thing that's different is that we're going to go through these in question answer format, and I'm going to try and keep it to an hour, but if it's possible, it might go over. So if you need to take a bathroom break or whatever, I'm sure I will. So I'll edit that part out though. Don't feel bad about pausing this video and coming back. Also, if I learn how to use YouTube a little bit better, I'm going to put links to the different questions down in the description so that if there's a topic that you're more curious about, you can just jump ahead to that part. But before we get to that stuff, the first question to answer, of course, is always, what gives you the right, Jeff? And this is what I do, right? So I make a podcast for KCRW. It's called Here Be Monsters. It's about things we're afraid of, things we don't understand. It's a sound-rich podcast. It's a show that I've been doing for 7 years. I started back in 2012. And that's this here. It's about a lot of different topics. And I also have my own work that I do on the side as an educator and as an artist. These are things that I've been doing for a while. It's not to say that I'm the ultimate authority. It's just that I've been doing it for a while and I have my opinions on this. So we're going to be talking about project organization. We're going to be talking about volume and loudness, which is a big topic. We're going to be talking about equalization. We're going to be talking about compression, not compression like MP3 compression, but compression in the sense of dynamic range compression or volume compression, which is the act of taking something loud and making it quieter. Another topic that you may or may not have run into in your own explorations of audio editing is this idea of auxiliary sends and busses. And if you don't know what these are, that's fine. I can tell you they're amazing. They're things that are really good about Reaper and really easy to use. But this will take a little bit of explaining, and I can show you why these are really great things to use in your mixes. And of course, we're going to be talking about mastering, which is one of the most misunderstood topics of all time. So without further ado, you can see I really blew the budget on graphics this time around. Let's get out of here and hop into Reaper. It might look a tad different than how your program looks, and that's just fine. I've actually, for the last 7 years, I've been tweaking the interface of Reaper, and I've tried here to reset it kind of mostly back to the way it comes out of the box, but it looks a little bit different. But what I want to show you first is I want to show you several things about the way that Reaper comes that I think are less than ideal. One thing that I really don't like about the way the program ships, and this makes sense because Reaper is fundamentally meant to be a music program, not a podcasting program, but we do not need the grid at all. We never need the grid. The grid is frustrating because when you drag stuff around, it's going to try and snap to these lines here, and we don't want that. So what you should do always is you should go into the grid settings. And the way you can get there is Alt and L. Or you can do what I do when I need to find things, which is pull up the actions list, which is a list of every single thing in the program, every single thing you can do in the program. And I just search for grid. And scroll down, scroll down, scroll down. How about grid settings? There we go. Show the snap and grid settings. Just double click on that. Turn this off. So much better. Okay, another thing we need to do. By default, Reaper has the ruler set to both show you the time that you're looking at, but also beats and measures. Again, since we're not using those things, the easiest thing you can do is you just right click on here, scroll down to minutes, seconds, and now we're looking at something so much nicer. Another thing is by default, it will zoom into the edit cursor. So look at my mouse over here. We're at the 10-minute mark, and no matter where my mouse is, we're just going to zoom closer and closer to where that edit cursor is. If I click over here, and I'm looking at something way off on this side of the screen, and I zoom in, it's still pulling me back to 5 minutes. What I think makes a ton more sense is to have the window zoom in wherever you have the mouse pointing. So let me show you this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up the options, go into Preferences, and I'm going to, because again, I'm lazy and I don't really remember where things are, I'm going to search for Zoom. Not that. Let's go one more. Here we go. Horizontal Zoom Center. So Horizontal Zoom Center. So instead of Edit Cursor, let's do Mouse Cursor. We'll hit OK. And now you can see it doesn't matter where this is. I can have it all the way back over here. But if I want to zoom to the 22-minute mark, that's where we're going to go. Zoom out. Same deal. And you can actually scoot across a project like this. This will make more sense when we actually load a project up. But you can actually scoot across a project in this way. One of the other things that is on by default is this mixer here. There's situations where you might want to look at the mixer, but most of the time we don't need it. The only thing we really need out of here is this master track, because it lets us see a lot of things that we need. So what you can do is you can right click on this master track, and we're just going to show it in the Docker. That'll pop over to the right side of the screen. And then we can close out of this. If you ever want the mixer back, it's just a Control M or Apple M if you're on a Mac. But for the most part, we don't need it. So we have this, we have our master track over here. The only other thing I want to change is that by default, the V key shows you the volume envelope. Seems logical enough, but actually the volume envelope isn't that useful to us. This is something that's much more useful to musicians. What we're going to change that to is we're going to change that to the volume pre-effects envelope. Now the reason for this, let me just pull in just a random piece of audio. The reason for this is that when you're using the volume envelope, you actually can't see your changes that you're making here, and that's really frustrating. So I don't think this is actually a really good behavior. What I think is better is to use the volume pre-effects envelope. Now I'm going to go into the actions list, and I'm going to search for volume pre-FX, and we can say show the pre-effects volume envelope. And I'm going to add the hotkey V. And it says, this is already mapped to a different envelope. And I say, yeah, that's okay. And now when I close this, you'll see that we have a bright green line instead of a dark green line. And the difference here is that as I make these changes, you can actually see in the waveform, things are changing. Now, these are all the main changes that I like to do before I even start editing with someone. Now, if that seems like that went by in a whirlwind, I encourage you to check out the previous videos in this series, especially episode 5, which is about customizing the Reaper interface. So I'm just going to turn off this thing that just came on. It's okay, I can blind myself for another couple hours with blue light because I want to load up a project right now. This is an episode of the show that I made just about 6 months ago, I think. It's called, what do we call this? I think it's called Scrap Heap Reactor. I put the picture of this person with the dentist mask on as a reminder as I'm loading things up that sometimes audio editing is painful. Sometimes it's like going to the dentist. That's something you can set in the preferences. Probably the best tip I've given you today. Actually, just really quick, one thing I wanted to show you here is that I number all of my versions to help keep them straight so that whenever I make big changes, I just make a new version of the piece itself. The way you do that is you do save a new version of a project, which is defaults to Control-Alt-Shift-S. And when I hit that keyboard combination, or if I do this, you can see the name of the project will change from Home Fusion 14 to Home Fusion 15. Isn't that nice? So this way I know if I make any mistakes, I can always go back to the version I had before. This is really a good common sense practice to do, and I highly encourage you to do it. So this is an episode that I made about a guy who is making his own nuclear fusion reactor in his bedroom. It turned into this episode of the show, which is called Scrap Heap Reactor, and it's a weird episode. And the reason I wanted to share it with you, though, is it sounds complex in its final form, but really it just comes from a couple hours of raw tape that I then broke down into smaller and smaller and smaller chunks until I wound up with something that looked like this. This episode it's about half an hour long, I think. Yeah. You can see these two white markers up here. These show the start and the end of the project. So yeah, it looks like it was just under half an hour when it was done. I use these special markers that tell Reaper where a project starts and where it ends. Now this is really helpful because I don't actually start my projects at the beginning of the project. I put all my raw tape at the beginning of the project, and we'll look at that in just a second. But what I do is I make my project at the end of the project actually, and I just tell it to start at an arbitrary place. And the way you do that is you make a marker that says equals start, and you do that in all caps. And as you might guess, similarly, at the end of the project, you make a marker that says equals end, all caps. It does have to be all caps. But then what happens is that when I go to render the project, and I say entire project here, you can see that the length of this isn't actually like 12 hours or whatever it actually is in the project. It says 29 minutes and 30 seconds. If I scoot these around and I go back there, you can see now it's 30 minutes and 21 seconds. So it pays attention to these markers. So what I do is I lay out my entire project here at the very end of the project. I'm about to zoom out here, and it will look really scary for a second, but promise me that you won't run away, because it's really not that bad. So if I zoom out here, what you can see here is that I put all my raw tape at the beginning. And I'm going to do a full episode on this at some point about how to do like good project workflow, but I just want to show you this really quick. Is what I do is I go and I listen to my tape, and I color code these different markers here that tells me where things are, so that if I'm ever at a point where I'm like, where was that tape about the gold ram sculpture, I can just look for it by going sculpture, and it'll just show me here. So this is how I work. And then what I do is I take the tape that's good from there, and I put it into little sections over here. I promise, like, I know this looks really confusing, but at a future point, I'll show you why this is good workflow and how it works. Another thing that's really helpful is, there we go. You can see a couple different layers of it now. So this is how I work. I think that it's really nice to be able to go back and find any audio at any given point. But work on your own workflow. Develop a way that makes sense for you. Another thing, before we get to the questions I just wanted to address, this is so helpful. Having mute tracks. This is like a soft delete. What I do is I just have a couple tracks in every project that are muted. And if there's audio that I'm not sure if I'm going to use or not, I just throw it up here and I let it hang out up here. And if I'm re-editing again, I'm like, actually, I do really miss, some bit of audio, I can just go pull it back out of here. I don't have to go find it back in my raw. Okay, so I know we're a couple minutes into this, but it's time for the questions. The producer who emailed me asked me, do you use a loudness meter? I do not, and I'm wondering if I should. If so, what plugin would you recommend? So loudness, right? Loudness is an interesting topic because when we talk about loudness, we're not actually talking about volume. Volume and loudness are these two really closely related things. But in recent years, it's become apparent that like typical volume is not the most accurate way to measure how loud something feels. And so some people somewhere figured out a way to more accurately represent how loud something sounds to us. And that's a unit of measurement called loudness. Now, volume is very closely related to that, of course, but it doesn't take into account like things that are considered really fast transients, like the snap of a finger or like a really loud pop for just a moment, which will make your normal meters over here really fly off the rails. But in reality, our brains don't really perceive them as that loud. And similarly, our ears are really tuned towards certain frequencies because those certain frequencies are the frequencies we use for voice. So things that are higher pitched generally sound louder to us than things that are lower pitched. So every meter in Reaper uses the traditional volume-based measurements that we're used to, things that are measured in decibels. And, I don't actually really pay that much attention to individual tracks volumes. But what I do keep an eye on is I keep an eye on this master meter. And as I'm playing back audio, let's just see what this is.
It's gone.
Processor.
CPU's probably also gone.
You just have the heatsink.
Yeah, someone is scrapping this for gold. A lot of people come here for gold, but I'm here for the lab equipment. Thermocycler here once. Who is a bio person, and she's down to clown with that.
What you need to know about the meters in Reaper is that by default, you have two kinds of outputs coming out. So these center bars here, I actually don't use these. These are called peak meters. I don't actually use these hardly at all. What I pay attention to is I pay attention to the outside.
Who is a bio person, and she's
Right there.
down to clown with that. Most expensive thing is that ion pump.
So that right there that you see, those two shorter bars, that's what's called RMS meters, and that stands for root mean sum. And what it is it's an average of the recent levels that have been coming through. And this is much more similar to how loudness works. These peak meters are really fast, they move really quick, and I don't actually think they're that useful. So what you need to pay attention to with those center bars is if they ever pop up into the red here.
The thing is that ion pump.
Like that's a peak, that's clipping. But aside from that, they're fairly deceiving because they don't actually really reflect how loud things sound. So if you want, and I don't necessarily recommend this, if you right click on the master meter, it shows you the settings for it. If you want, you can actually get rid of the peak meter and you can just look at the RMS.
Fine. Again, I'm not a bio guy, so
Just like this.
luckily I have a friend who is a bio person, and she's down to clown with that. Most
And
expensive.
that will show you right there. That will show you just the RMS. And as far as target levels go, what we're going to be talking about in the later portion of this is that when you're mixing, you shouldn't be trying to get things as loud as you want them for your final project. What you should be doing for mixing is you should try to get to a consistent level that works for you. When I'm doing my mixing phase before my mastering, I'm generally aiming for the voice to be right around here. Which might seem really low, but what that does is it gives you a lot of headroom or space above the loudest parts of your mix, where if there is just an incidental moment where something is really loud, it's not going to peak. And so what you should be worrying about at this point is you should be worrying about putting your volume on your computer to a very specific level that you always leave it at and never touch it. So for me, I have a big volume knob that goes from like 0 to 100, and I leave it at 25%. If it's a clock, I leave it at 9 o'clock, and I never touch it. And I know that if I'm doing my volume mixing right, that should be roughly loud enough for me to listen to a voice at a comfortable level. It shouldn't be too loud or too quiet. So that's the main thing you need to be paying attention to. Don't be clipping, and don't be fiddling with your volume knob. Just leave it as it is. We'll talk about this more in the mastering section. However, on the master track, I do run a loudness meter, which is called Isotope Insight. And what this shows me is a bunch of information about the loudness output of what I'm working on. I should probably do a whole tutorial just on loudness at some point, but if you want a really good reference on how to think about loudness correctly, you should look at an article that Rob Byers put out on Transom. I think it was on Transom. I'll put a link to that down below. And that's what really changed my mind about how loudness works. So I use this one called Isotope Insight, and I can see the integrated loudness here. I can see the momentary loudness here and the short-term loudness here, all the main things that are important.
Thermocycler here once. Works totally fine. Again, I'm not a bio guy, so...
Now, I think this is a great plugin. I don't actually use it that much when I'm just mixing things. I use this in the mastering phase, but there's a really good free one that is called Ulean Meter 2. Let's just pull this on the master track as well. And this one is nice because there's a built-in loudness graph that just shows you over time how things are changing.
I'm not a bio guy, so luckily I have a friend who is a bio person, and she's down to clown with that.
So
most expensive.
It's all the same. It's all the same information. It's just presented in a slightly different way. And this is a free plugin. And what you can do with this is you can say, okay, well that section, I was kind of hitting -23, which is the target that I aim for in my mixing phase. But if I go over here,
1,000 in terms of scale, like if you can imagine $10, you can imagine.
Yeah, we have that. It's going to hit in roughly the same range.
it has something that seems like it. Anyway, the important part of this story is that ever since then, I've been constantly prying into what are convenient lies that we tell ourselves, what are convenient lies.
So again, this is not something to be focusing on in your mixing phase. Be focusing on your loudness in your mastering phase, which should be the last step that you do before you publish something. We'll get to that later in this episode. So let's move on to our next question here, which is about EQ, or equalization. Our producer says, I almost never use EQ unless it's to get rid of a plosive or maybe to adjust a sound effect. Do you use EQ on vocals? The short answer to this question is yes, absolutely. I always use EQ on vocals. And there's some really simple things that you can do on every track that will make your mix sound better. But there's also more minor things to do with vocals. So one thing the producer mentioned is she said that she used them to get rid of plosives. Now, I think I've probably already gotten rid of all the plosives in this piece, but if I did find one, plosives, I'm gonna pick up the mic here. Plosives are these loud P and B sounds that pop out the microphone. Plosives are a natural thing. I mean, you can do things to reduce them by all means, but sometimes they just kind of show up and you need to get rid of them. So this producer is saying that she uses equalization to get rid of plosives. What that would look like is snipping, and then we can click up here, or we can pull up the effects browser. Let's do it this way. We'll pull up the effects browser and we'll look for RIA EQ, this one. This is one that you should have on retainer. This is a really useful plugin. And what we can do is we can pull out all those bass notes that make those P's and B's, make those plosives pop. And then when we play this back,
together,
it will have no bass in it anymore. And that's what we want. You just want to do this for a tiny second though. So let's do that. We'll get rid of this one because we don't need extra of these. And now we just have it for that one moment, even though this isn't a plosive. You get the idea. So the thing though is that you actually want to be using EQ on just about everything. Now, it can seem a little bit intimidating to pull up this window here, but really this is pretty basic stuff. So the first thing that I do is I always get rid of all the sub bass down here, all these really low frequencies. From the default settings. Let's just reset defaults. There we go. So this is how the plugin looks when you first open it up. It might look more like this here. The first thing I always do is I always say, it's a human voice. Human voices don't go this low. There's nothing good down here. All that you have down here is like airplanes and like stomach rumbles and just things that you don't need in your mix at all. So let's just take out, for voice, we're going to take out everything below 100. This is rule of thumb. This isn't like science in any way. This is just something that I know I don't need. And what we do by taking out that sub bass is we free that up for other things if we want them there, or if we don't want anything there, that's fine. I mean, how many podcast listeners are going to be listening with a subwoofer? Probably like less than 1%. So it's fine to have nothing down there, but things tend to show up down there no matter what you do. So take out all the bass, for voices, that is. Take out all that bass. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find where the bad frequencies are here. So I'm going to make a little loop right here. And I'm going to click on repeat, just so I can hear it over and over again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bump up a frequency really high. This is a method called find the crap. Let's find a different loop. Let's just scoot over here. Hopefully a place where I sound really smart. I'm going to boost a frequency really loud, and I'm going to search for the place where it sounds the worst.
And if it works, then it's just a matter. If it works, then it's just a matter of scale and engineering to bring it to something that could actually produce energy.
There.
Again, it's solvable.
That's
problems.
really bad.
If it works, then it's just a matter of.
You say, Jeff, why did you make it sound really bad? Well, the thing is, if you know what makes it sound bad, you know what makes it sound good too. So we're kind of at 336 hertz right here. Probably pretty napkin math, but this is how you do it. You just trust your ear. So again, this is what it sounds like when it's really bad.
if it works, then it's just
you can
a
hear that
matter of
resonant tone there, that boo-doo-doo-doo-doo-doo sound. We want to get rid of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut it out. I'm going to take the area where it sounded the worst and I'm going to cut it out. Probably just a couple decibels. Doesn't need to be much.
If it works, then it's just a matter of scale and engineering to bring it.
So here's the original.
If it works, then it's just a matter of scale and engineering to.
And here's the affected.
If it works, then it's just a matter of scale and engineering to bring it.
So it's not a huge difference, honestly. It's pretty subtle, but these minor little shifts, again, what they do is they get rid of the bad frequencies, the frequencies that are overrepresented, and it gives you a more even sounding voice, and that is what you do want. So what's interesting is this area that I've identified here, kind of the 250, kind of 200 to 400 range is often what's referred to in the mixing community as the mud zone. And the mud zone is an area that is often overrepresented by mics. And therefore, these frequencies tend to build up in mixes. And I know that the mic that I was using in this situation is very guilty of this. It tends to pick up too many frequencies in the mud zone. So if you're saying like, hey, this voice doesn't sound quite right, and I'm not sure why, I would say first step you do, cut the sub bass. Second thing you do is you should probably check out this area here and try, looking at pulling out 3 to 9 decibels out of it. And there's a chance that you'll get a better sounding signal. Now, one thing I should mention is that generally speaking, the common wisdom is that you should be using EQ to cut frequencies, not to add them. That's not a hard and fast rule. There are certain situations where you say, like I actually do want a tad more here. Or I'm going to add another band here. I was like, oh, just a tad more in the middle. But the thing that you shouldn't be doing probably, like I would say the thing to avoid would be like making curves that look like this, Like this is going to mess things up. This isn't going to do you any favors. And I could go into the psychology of that if you wanted, but I would say it's probably more expedient for you to just take my word on this, is use the EQ to cut frequencies more than you use it to add them. Okay, let's move on to compression now. Our producer says, I put compression on each speaker's track. How do you use compression? Let's actually just really quickly address the reasons to use compression. Compression is this act of using a plugin to take the loudest parts of your mix and turn them into quieter parts of your mix. Now, what's the reason for that? Well, it's to reduce dynamic range, the range between the quietest parts of your audio and the loudest parts of your audio. Just generally, the way we speak, we tend to put more emphasis on the beginnings of our sentences than the ends of our sentences. And kind of the way that most people talk, and I do this too, is that I kind of trail off at the end of my sentences, and then I start a new thought really loud and I trail off again at the end of my sentences. And generally speaking, what we want to do is we want to just squash that down a little bit, squash down that difference so that the ends of the sentences are not so quiet and the beginnings of the sentences are not so loud. And the way we do this is with compression. It makes things that sound a little bit louder, makes things sound a little bit smoother. At least it can make things sound louder. It depends how you use it. It definitely makes things sound smoother. So here's a section. Okay, so like when I zoom out, what I can see here, I'm just looking at right in this section right here. What I can see is I can see that it starts a little bit quieter, gets a little bit louder, gets a little bit louder still, gets quieter, gets quieter, gets quieter. Now I've done a little bit of adjustment on this already using the item volumes, just these lines here that show up on your items. If you don't see them, it means that they're just hiding at the top. Okay, so we have these red bars here. You can adjust things that way, and I've done a little bit of that already. If I was doing my compression, like pseudo compression manually, what I'd be using is I'd be using here this volume envelope, and I would say we want this to be kind of a little bit louder. We want this. If this is confusing to you, you should watch my tutorial on automation. But it's just a simple process. Now the thing is that like this takes forever. I wouldn't recommend doing like entire interviews this way. This is essentially manual compression. I'm just kind of looking at the waveform. I'm trying to level it off a little bit. This is awful. I wish I had never done this because this would take forever. I'm looking at, whatever, like a couple seconds of audio here. And it's a little bit flatter. Circle, that one that's in the middle, is going to fly out of there.
Yeah, it'll always find a way out. It's not even that you can't put a second one in there, it's that the first one will find a way out. It'll always find a way out. And so they'll always it's called an assemblage of particles. The assemblage will always break down. But if you move it, and you move it in the right way, you can get something to stay in that confined area.
So that's actually pretty good.
It's constant.
This would take forever to do though, and I don't recommend it. I recommend getting things close, kind of like I did here. Getting things close and then using compression to do all the fine work for you. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to go into the effects here. I'm going to say add. I'm going to find a compressor. The one that's built into Reaper is called Reacomp, REACOMP. And I'm just going to pull it onto this track here. You can also just double click, does the same thing. Pull it onto this track. And the important thing about compressors is that they don't do anything when you first apply them. They do nothing. And that's because there are a couple controls here that we need to pay a lot of attention to. The first of those controls is what's called the threshold. Now again, what compression does is it looks for the loudest parts of your audio and it says, hey, loud part of audio, I want you to be just a tiny bit quieter. So what we first say is we say, hey, what's loud audio considered in here? So I'm just gonna play this back. Circle. That one that's in the middle is gonna fly out of there.
Yeah, it'll always find a way out. It's not even that you can't put a second one in there, it's that the first one will find a way out. It'll always find a way out. And so they'll always, it's called an assemblage of particles. The assemblage will always break down.
So kind of like that last section, that's like what's right here is what's loud. So we could say, hey, maybe that's just a little bit too loud. So we're going to set this threshold down here. And if this green line goes above this line right here, then that's how we know that the compressor is going to get engaged.
The assemblage will always break down. But if you move it, and you move it in the right way.
You're saying, this sounds exactly the same, and you'd be right. The other really important part of the compressor is the ratio. And the ratio says, hey, as soon as we've exceeded this level, how much are we going to cut back on it? And kind of a normal range for a ratio for voice is kind of, I would say, like, keep it less than 3:1, which means that for every 3 decibels that come in over the threshold, only 1 will come out. Things more than that start to get sounding really weird, and there's a lot of good tutorials that you'll find on YouTube about how to compress voice effectively. I'm not going to get into the weeds of this, but I'll just say to you that when I compress voice, what I use is probably usually a ratio of about 1.5:1, which is really gentle. 1:1 means it does nothing, right? Infinity to 1 means that it will not let audio exceed a certain level. And kind of the range that I usually work with is maybe 1:1, or excuse me, 1.5:1 to maybe 2:1. And another thing I use is I use what's called a knee, which kind of turns the effect on and off slowly. It gives you a little bit of wiggle room around this threshold. These are kind of the settings that I find. I use a really, really wide knee and a really gentle ratio. These are the settings that I find make voice sound really natural when you compress it. So again, pay attention to, I'm going to turn it off for a second. We'll listen to the initial and pay attention to our RMS values over here.
An assemblage of particles. The assemblage will always break down. But if you move it, and you move it in the right way, you can get something to...
And now I'm going to turn our compressor on, and I'll scoot this over here so we can see it a little bit closer. And what I want you to also look at is I want you to look at this red meter over here, which is showing you how many decibels of volume it's pulling out.
An assemblage of particles. The assemblage will always break down. But if you move it, and you move it in the right way, you can get something to stay.
Now, it's going to sound maybe roughly the same to you. This isn't super strong compression. We could really make this effect strong if I pulled the ratio all the way down, you know, something like that. Let's listen now.
It's called an assemblage of particles. The assemblage will always break down. But if you move it, and you move it in the right way.
And you can see that that is now significantly quieter. But when we were doing it with this softer ratio, with this softer threshold at around -20 decibels, you see it was pulling out maybe 3 decibels of volume. Now the thing is that because we've shaved off those high peaks here, what that means is that we can add about another 3 decibels in without the audio clipping or getting above the level we want. So what I could do is I could take this wet slider over here, and the wet is the affected signal that's run through the compressor. I could add another 2 decibels to it if I wanted, without negative consequence, which is nice. Compression is something that is best done very gently. There's a million more things to say about compression, but I just want that to be the main takeaway, is do it gently. There's no shame in doing it a couple times too. So I often use mild compression on an individual track, and then I might use it also up here on the whole voice folder, which is actually what we're going to talk about next. And then I might use it on the master bus, and then I might use it when we're actually mastering the project in the next session. So the thing is that if you ever overdo it, you can't really undo it. But if you do it too gently, you can always fix that later. So again, compression is something that I encourage you to experiment with to your heart's delight. Just realize that the temptation is always going to be to overdo it, because when you do it right, you probably shouldn't actually be able to tell that the audio is compressed. And when you do it wrong, there's no real going back. I mean, of course, with the exception of just going back in here and tweaking the threshold and the ratio to the right place. So this is what I use. There's other settings in here that are important to a degree, but not as important as the threshold, the ratio, and the wet out. The only other thing that you might want to pay attention to is the attack and the release, but I actually find in Recomp that these settings are pretty good for voice, which is a 3 millisecond attack, which is how long it takes for the compressor to turn on when something has exceeded this threshold, and the release, which is how long it takes for the volume to return to normal after the threshold has been, whatever the opposite of exceeded is, unexceeded. And these honestly, I can't think of the last time I changed these for voice. So experiment with compression. Now, we're going to talk about Auxes and Busses, auxiliary sends and buses. Our producer asks, do you use auxiliary tracks and buses? When? The answer to both questions is yes, and as far as when, the answer is all the time. I use them all the time. Now, this project has plenty of buses, and buses in Reaper are called folders. Folders. And they're really easy to use. Let's make a new project. New project. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm just double clicking, we're making tracks. We got 6 tracks. Now, as this currently is any clip that is in any one of these tracks is just a separate entity. But if I say I have a lot of tracks that are of similar quality, so in this project and this other project, the similar quality here is that all of this audio is voice. Similar quality here is that all of this is like sound effects or B-roll or something that isn't voice. Everything that's similar in these tracks is that they're all music. So I've got music, sounds, you know. And the benefit of this is that I can affect all of these things in a similar way. So for the voice, I actually have effects on all the voice tracks. I do have a compression on the voice, a very slight compression. Actually, no, this is a stronger compression. This is a 3-to-1 compression ratio, but the threshold is a little bit high, and the knee size is actually really big. So I'm actually using quite a bit of compression in this piece. I think probably because of the variable nature of the audio that we recorded in the scrap heap. I'm also using a declicking plugin. I'm using a dialogue denoiser plugin. I'm using another form of compression that is pulling out the S's, all those sibilant S's, and another little bit of compression. There's actually a lot happening to the voice in this project. I didn't realize that. And all of those plugins are all being applied down into the tracks that are in its folder. So if you want to make a folder, all you have to do, and this is actually really easy, is select whatever tracks you want, and you just drag them into whatever track you want to be a folder track, and then it'll just instantly get converted, and you'll see that it's kind of indented here. And as you make new tracks, you can see this is outside of the folder, this is outside of the folder, but if we wanted to add this one to the folder, you do just like that. Zoom out a little bit, and this is the parent track, and this is the child track. So anything that's in here, let's just copy paste a little bit of audio. let's just snag a section out of here. Let's actually just do it right in here. So so this goes for everything. Anything that is happening on this parent track is happening to the children track. So I can actually do a volume boost here, and you can see I can actually affect everything in this folder. If there's multiple tracks in there, it will affect the volumes of multiple tracks. Say here in the sound folder, you can see I have some walking sounds, and I have some sounds of his machine running. So let's listen to this. And we can solo it. So we're just only hearing this track, not all the music. And if I wanted to make this louder or quieter, I could just draw automation here in the folder, and then that's affected as such. And similarly, if I wanted to add an effect to this entire set of tracks, like let's just say I put some reverb on everything, just grab reverb in here, throw it on here, and now when we listen, everything should have reverb. So I think actually Reaper makes this really easy, and this is something I encourage you to try. Group your similar tracks together. Let's just do one more quick example. So here's some music. And if you watch my last tutorial, I talked a little bit about ways that you can affect music to pull it underneath someone talking. So what I have set up here is I just have a resonant low-pass filter, which is a built-in Reaper plugin, and I have that set up on the folder track. And what I do is that as soon as he starts talking again up here, I just pull down this low-pass filter so that we can hear him talking a little bit better. And that's kind of what this sounds like here. You can hear how there's suddenly no more high frequencies in there, which frees up space for Max to talk a little bit. Whereas if I pull this back up, we have all those high frequencies back again. And this is what that sounds like in the mix. So I'm gonna turn it on.
There. And then eventually it just sort of pulses with the variability of the input current or input voltage. But when it's running and everything's been fully disassociated, then it's invisible.
And as you can see, this low-pass filter is affecting every one of these purple tracks here, which are all the music tracks. So it's a way of applying effects and applying changes to vast swaths of your project in one fell swoop. So let's say call this parent, call this child, oops, chili, child, yeah, right. We could call this grandchild, and I'll show you here. There's no limit to the number of the number of folders that you make, and you can nest them just like this. So that's how folders work. These are really helpful for organizing bigger projects. Now, another thing that our producer asked about was auxiliary tracks. Now, auxiliary tracks are probably the most advanced thing we're going to be talking about in this, and I'm just going to scratch the surface of this because this could make this video way too long. Now, what an auxiliary track is it's a track that has the audio coming in from multiple other tracks and applying some kind of processing to it. That sounds really abstract, and it kind of is. I'll show you instead just what I use them for. And I do this in almost every project now, is what I use it for is I use it for processing reverb. Reverb is a really good way of adding space to your tracks. We just added a little bit of reverb on something, I think in the sounds folder, right? And reverb is a type of processing that takes a lot of your computer's power to figure it out. It's kind of a power hungry type of plugin. And so once you have like 30 reverbs running on your project, your computer's going to slow down and you're going to get latency, and it's going to be a big pain. Similarly, if you want to change something after the fact, if you say, actually, I don't like that reverb sound, you have to go in and you have to change it manually like 30, 50, 100 times. It's just not good. It's not a good way to work. So what you can do instead is you can set up what are called auxiliary channels or auxiliary tracks, which just are used for processing effects. So I'm going to do it actually in this project here because I didn't actually mix this with an auxiliary track. You can see, was I doing it wrong? I think I was using a different effect here. I was using a kind of similar to reverb effect for the ends of music tracks. So let's listen to this really quick. I'm just going to solo it. Like this. You can hear that kind of tail, that little sound. Now, I actually like the way that sounds, but usually what I would be doing, I'm using kind of a similar to a reverb effect here that isn't quite a reverb effect. So I'm going to get rid of that effect. I'm just going to show you what setting up an auxiliary reverb track sounds like. And just bear with me here as I do some kind of funny clicking. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new track. I'm going to call this reverb bus or reverb aux. Either it kind of mean the same thing. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so I can see it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag from this box right here. I'm going to drag from music, my music bus, my music folder. I'm going to drag it into the same thing here. You can see there's actually right on the mouse cursor, there's like a little audio jack plugin, like a headphone jack. I'm going to drop it on here and a window's going to pop up. We have this window that pops up that says send audio track, send to track 19 reverb bus, and it controls for the music track. And for the time being, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this all the way off, because if I leave this on, it's just going to copy the audio over there and it's going to be just twice as loud. So actually, let's listen to that. Let's listen to that right now. And you can see there was audio coming through there. There's audio coming through our music track. So, but all it's doing right now is it's doubling it because there's nothing happening to this audio. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here. I'm going to grab a copy of Reverb. I'm going to drag it onto our reverb auxiliary track. And now when I play it, you can hear it's got that reverb tail on it. A couple things we need to change though. For one, right now, it's still going to be twice as loud because we have our dry signal on the reverb all the way up. And the dry signal is the unaffected signal, which is actually already playing through the music track. So we don't actually want to double that up. So when you're using auxiliary sends, you want to turn the dry signal all the way down. So now when we play it, ooh, that sounds nice. It does sound nice. Okay, now when we play that, it sounds a little bit better. However, the other downside of this is that no matter what, I'm going to solo our music track, which still lets the reverbs play, still lets the auxiliary tracks play. The big problem we have is that whenever I play anything, it's going to be totally reverb nonsense. And we don't want that. We don't want that. We need to control very granularly where our reverbs are happening. So the way I was doing it here was actually pretty effective, which is just to throw something right on the tail of a clip that's fading out. But instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this reverb auxiliary track. So the way to do that is to pull out your track control panel here a little bit. And we are looking for this icon right here, which shows us which automation envelopes are visible. So I'm going to click that, and you can see here that there's a couple effects. We have our track envelopes. These are all the basic ones, you know, like our volume that we were looking at earlier. But I also have send envelopes, and I have the effects that are on here, like that low pass filter. What we're interested in is the send envelope. When we're looking at reverb aux send volume, I'm just going to tick that box. And it's going to show me this line. This line is how much of the audio from this folder is going to our aux track. And for the most part, we want that to be all the way off. We don't want any of that reverb coming through. But for these little sections, these little tails, I'm just going to add a couple little points right here, right here, right here. I'm just going to pull that up. Maybe kind of like that. Let's see how that sounds. just right where we want it. And that's all we need to do. That's how an aux send works, and these are really useful. You can use these for a lot of different kinds of effects, but usually it works best with time-based effects. So like another thing you might use this for, I'm just going to get rid of reverb, and I'm going to add delay. Same idea, right? We had turned down the dry signal so that it doesn't double the dry signal. And now when we do this, I encourage you to experiment with this. Aux sends can be really a good creative tool for making your mixes sound different. Time for the last question. I bought Ozone 8 elements recently to help with mixing, and I feel like I barely understand it. I use it only on vocal tracks. I use the Master Assistant, which automatically does the EQ, so I guess I have started using EQ. It's usually fairly minimal. And stereo imaging, although I have no idea about this part, and the maximizer, which is supposed to help you hit the LUFS, which is a loudness thing, the LUFS limit for streaming, which they say is -14 LUFS. It usually seems to boost it too loud, and then I need to adjust the threshold, which then makes me feel like I've erased what the tool is supposed to be doing. This is a long question and it's complex, and I read the thing in full because I think this is indicative of how I hear people talking about mastering, which is that there's like a lot of jargon and it's really hard to understand whether what your efforts are doing are making any difference. This is a question about mastering, and I should really, like, with a big grain of salt, say that I don't feel like mastering is my strong point because it's just so specific. But what mastering is it says, hey, like, you have this incredibly complex project, right? And you've been mixing it correctly because you've been doing what I've been telling you to do, which is to mix things quiet, mix them so that nothing is peaking, mix them so that it's way quieter than what you're normally used to hearing, like in like finished music, like commercial music, or like WNYC podcasts, or like what have you, like things that are really loud. Mix it way quieter than that, and then export it to a new project, and then get it where it needs to go. The reason for that is that if you do that all in one session, you're probably going to be mixing things a little bit sloppy, and you're going to be relying on your mastering plugins to do way too much work for you. So mastering plugins, like Ozone is a mastering plugin. Mastering plugins work best when they're acting really gently on a finished product. Everything else that you do, as far as EQ and compression and whatnot, everything else you do on a per track level, that should be done in your mixing session. What I do is that when I'm ready to export for my final mastering session, I go into the render settings, and I have a preset made that is final. To master. And what my settings are here is I have it render out as the project name. That's what this $sign does. You can find these over here in wildcards. You can say all of these different things, and I just render it out as the project name. So you can see that the name of this exported file will be homefusion_15 because that's what the name of the project is. And I render it out 44.1K. I do it in real time. I'm not sure if that's helping anything or not, but it's just a superstition, and honestly it gives me time to get up and stretch and do other things. And then what else? 24-bit wave is important. 16-bit wave doesn't give you as much space to wiggle around with volumes. So I use 24-bit wave for my mastering. I export the markers and regions, although that's totally optional. And then I hit render. Okay. So if I let this go, it would render for half an hour. And then I would be left with a 2-channel wave file. And I'm just going to pull in my pre-mastered audio here. And okay. I'm just going to pull in my pre-mastered audio from this project. We'll delete all this stuff. And the most recent one I had, I think, was this. So here's what I'm looking at now. This is my audio that is ready to be mastered. And you can see one really important thing here, which I feel like I've been browbeating a little bit, but you can see that it's kind of quiet looking. And that's important because that gives us room, that's that headroom that I was talking about earlier, that lets us really finely tweak things. So when I'm mastering, the first thing I'm always doing is I just bring up a volume envelope and I say, okay, let's take care of the big stuff. I'd listen really quiet so I could hear those volume changes really strongly, because our ears are much better at hearing differences in quiet volumes than they are hearing differences in loud volumes. So I turn my speakers down really quiet, or put on headphones and I turn them down really quiet, and I say, what is jumping out at me and what is not jumping out at me? What is receding into the mix? And so I'm not going to do that now, but I'm just kind of doing it by sight, which isn't a good way to do this by any means. And I do my rough adjustments. And then, and only then, do I bring in plugins. So let's actually open up my mastering session for this track. And I'll just show you kind of what this looks like in reality. What did I call it? I called it 104 Master. Okay. So I had my whole volume situation here. It looks like I started cutting out audio here because I had heard that it got a little bit louder than in other places. I boosted up just a tiny bit in this section, not by much, like by less than a decibel. And then that's it. And then I used a couple effects. What did I use? I used a tiny bit of EQ to cut some of that sub bass out. I used that same peak limiter in case anything gets a little bit too spicy. I used a maximizer, which maximizers make things louder. And essentially I'm boosting the whole project here by a little bit less than 4 decibels. I'm using a hard limiter here, which prevents any wayward peaks from coming out. And most importantly, at the end of my chain, these things get processed in order. So at the very end, I'm looking at the final output. I'm saying, how loud are you? And again, Isotope's insight measures things in terms of loudness units, not decibels. And the target level that I have for the podcast that I produce is -19 LUFS, -19 loudness units. And that's a little bit quieter than most people use. A lot of people are using -16. Some people who are terrible use -14. Some people who are even worse than that use -12. I mean, I'm being hyperbolic, of course, but loudness is a really sensitive subject. And for the work that I do, I think that -19 LUFS allows me to have kind of the creative freedom I want to go loud, to go quiet, to do everything in between without feeling like I'm being constrained by hitting the upper limits of what audio allows. And if you're doing a program that is just voice, no music, no sound design, then it's fine to go a little bit louder, but it's just, it's a big topic of debate as far as like what is a good level for a podcast. And a lot of people have settled on -16 loudness units. Let's listen to a little bit of this and watch this loudness graph here, and also pay attention to this integrated loudness. And again, my target is kind of roughly -19. So I'll pull this up a little bit. We'll say -19, and I'm just gonna kind of scrub around in here. Additionally, I'm going to be, I'm just gonna pop out this peak limiter, and that's actually it. Well, actually, let's take a look at the EQ too. So it goes in this order. It goes EQ, it goes peak limiter, and at the very end, we get to watch the loudness. Get rid of this window. Let's just kind of scrub around in here and see what happens.
Plummets. And my fear is that's what's happening with humans and oil and fossil fuels, where we found this
Here on Earth.
fusion. It just doesn't happen naturally. I mean, it happens naturally in that it happens in stars.
Like, what have you found? What is it that you...
One in the middle to stay in the middle. It'll always find a way to get out of the other elephants. So you can't trap an angry elephant in a circle of other angry elephants. It doesn't work that way.
Like when you try to get something truncated icosahedron. Am I saying it right?
Yeah,
Icosahedron. Truncated icosahedron.
Which is, in beauty is eternal truth revealed, and physics is really a search for these fundamental truths. A thing for, not something you should do.
Bomb maker in a movie, say. Are figuring something out that is... Look.
Good eye, it is.
When I make soup sometimes, I will puree it. And then suddenly, when the stove's running, these like bubbles will... Okay, so this is kind of where I want it to be. We're kind of bumping around -19, -20. I mean, this isn't by any means a fully representative sample of exactly what's going on here. But one thing that you should do is you should say, hey, what is a piece of reference material that I can compare my mixes to make sure they're kind of roughly the same place. So what I do is I actually, for every episode I master, I pull in the previous episode and check it against that. Sometimes I'll check it against another episode before that. I'll say, which one of these is louder? Like, does it sound crunchier? Does it sound like there's too much low end in one? Does it sound like there's too much high end in one? And I compare things to reference material. So I just leave those on tracks down here that I mute and unmute as needed. So I usually just mute it, and then so I'll compare here.
Is if you ever
And
look
I'll
up
compare
a
that to here.
Boots and stuff. He's dressed all in white with the clothes that
there, the population explodes.
are supposed to happen and no order.
Magnitude past that.
Cast. Do you wish there
Right now,
Huh.
you can actually see
Yoruba religion from West.
from, I think it was Feynman.
Powerful.
So I mean, it's probably not perfect, but it's close enough. What you want is you want consistency for your listener, and that's what you're trying to do in the mastering stage. You're trying to give some kind of consistency for your listener. The thing you really don't want is you don't want them having to tweak the volume knob throughout the listening of your program. When I have things where I want them to be, what I do is I export a version of it and I see if it's hitting my overall target loudness. And the way I do that, I actually use a third-party program for that. I use something called Orban Loudness Meter. And the thing I like about this program, this is a free program. The thing I like about this program is it will analyze a bunch of files for you at once and see how loud they are, and you can kind of click through and compare. The one thing that's a big problem with this piece of software is that it has to reanalyze them every single time, and it takes forever. But when it's done doing this, what it does, it pops out a number for you here for your integrated loudness, your overall loudness. It'll show you how much variation in loudness there is throughout the piece. It'll show you if you have anything that's peaking, that's so loud that it's clipping. It'll show you how many times that happens. And what I really like is I can compare between episodes to see how my loudness is changing over time. If there is like loudness creep, either going too loud or too quiet. I really like using this program, although when I'm actually using my brain, I will open this up about half an hour before I need to use it because it does take a long time to do this. There's other software that does this as well. So that's the end of the questions that I was asked by this producer, but I do really want to throw in one extra piece of advice here. And this is probably my biggest piece of advice that I want to give, which is that I've given you a ton of information. I've showed you a lot of how I do this process of mixing and mastering for Here Be Monsters. Now, the thing that's important about this is something that I've developed. This is a workflow that I've developed over a number of years. And there's tons of things that I've tried that I haven't incorporated into my final workflow. And what I encourage you to do is not to like take this video as verbatim, like writ, like word from God by any means. Please don't do that. Because what you need to be doing is you need to be adjusting your workflow slowly. You need to be trying to figure out why you're changing things in your workflow so that you don't accidentally get into bad habits. So adapt your workflow really slowly, start tweaking things and start with the biggest problems that you have. Like, for example, maybe you're EQing wrong. Wrong is maybe a too much of a supposition, but maybe you're EQing in a way that isn't actually making your life easier. Maybe you're doing things that will frustrate you further down the line. A lot of times, again, like what I see people doing is I see people EQing in ways that add a lot of really nasty frequencies. Like I've seen people, and I've done this too. I've EQ'd people like this before, and it just makes your life miserable in the long run. So look at your biggest problems first. Maybe your overall projects are too loud. Maybe your overall projects have too much dynamic range. Maybe you're over compressing your audio. Start with the big things first and try things out. The really nice thing about Reaper is that it is very forgiving of your mistakes, because with some very limited exceptions, you can always go back in and tweak these settings later. Maybe it needed to be down here. I just want to throw a couple thank yous out there. Thank you to the producer who asked these questions. Again, if you have questions that you want me to answer, I'm more than happy to talk to you to arrange kind of these further Q&A type episodes. If you want to listen to the final project that we were listening to, again, this is an episode of the podcast I produce, which is called Here Be Monsters. It's at hbmpodcast.com, and this is episode 104. It's called Scrap Heap Reactor, and you can subscribe just anywhere you listen to podcasts. Any podcast app should have Here Be Monsters in it. Okay, I think that's it. I appreciate you sitting through this really long tutorial, and hopefully there will be more in the future. I would really like to keep this project going, so don't be shy about getting in touch. All right, thanks.